Welcome. We're glad you found this recorded presentation by the Knox County Master Gardeners. We are a volunteer community service group affiliated with the University of Tennessee, as well as Tennessee State University and their cooperative extension programs. The mission of the Knox County Master Gardener program is to educate and serve the community using research-based information on best practices in horticulture, environmental stewardship, and integrated pest management. One of the ways we educate is through our Speakers Bureau. We normally present to live audiences 4 times a month, with 2 topics being presented twice, once on a Saturday at a county branch library, and a repeat on a weekday at a county senior center. But with COVID-19, these are not normal times. During May, all 4 of our regular county venues were closed. The duration of those closures is expected to be 8 weeks. And because of our affiliation with the University of Tennessee, we are banned from any public gathering of any size until August 1. So, after sitting on the sidelines during April and May, we have found an alternate way to present the talks that we had on the schedule for June and July. It is likely that we will continue this alternate delivery method in August. We hope to be back in front of live audiences for September and October, and if we are, we plan to record those sessions. If group gatherings of up to 50 people are still prohibited, we will complete our planned schedule using this new format. On the slide, you see our website address and a portion of our website homepage. The website provides information on Knox County Master Gardener projects and activities, and includes a calendar of events. All of our Speakers Bureau talks are on this calendar and include the name of the presenter, the topic, and a brief description. For the talks given in this alternative method, you will also find the link to where the recorded presentation can be found. Thanks again for finding this particular recording, and now let's get started with the actual presentation.
Welcome to Tomatoes 911, a presentation of Knox County Extension Master Gardeners Speakers Bureau. I'm Joe Pardue, and I'm a Knox County Master Gardener. Let's start with defining some terms. We want to compare the heirloom tomatoes to the hybrid tomatoes. Heirloom tomatoes are open pollinated, which means that you can save the seeds, and the plant that you grow from the seeds will be like the original. They're typically known for having better flavor than the hybrids. An example of the heirloom is the Cherokee Purple shown here. Although it doesn't look like a bright red tennis ball, as some people expect tomatoes to look, this dark tomato is very meaty and very tasty. It was actually discovered one county over in Sevier County, and the story is that about 100 years ago, some farmers received some seeds from some Cherokees, and they eventually, these farmers gave some of the seeds to the Seed Savers Exchange, where they got into the commercial market, and now they're very popular. The next term is hybrid tomatoes, and these are close pollinated. You can't save the seeds. These are known primarily for being disease resistant and for their productivity. An example here is a Juliet hybrid tomato. It's a cross between a cherry and a Roma tomato. Other terms, we want to compare growth habits. The growth habit here on the left is called indeterminate, which is vine type tomatoes. They grow up until the first frost, and they'll produce tomatoes the whole time. The tomato on the right are called determinate tomatoes, and they're also called bush varieties. These are developed for commercial purposes. They tend to be 4 or 5 feet tall, and they tend to have a flush of tomatoes that lasts about 2 weeks to facilitate commercial harvests. Now, we're going to look at 3 basic types of tomato problems. First, there's diseases like viruses or bacteria or fungi. Next, there are physiological disorders. These are typically caused by the weather or by the soil. And finally, we're going to look at insect pests. First, let's look at a virus. The yellow leaf curl virus infects the whole plant, and there really isn't anything you can do to save a plant that has this. You need to take it out of the ground, put it in a bag, and put it in your garbage. Do not compost it. This disease is caused by, uh, or spread rather, by whiteflies. The whiteflies get on the plant, they carry the virus, and the whiteflies will suck the sap from the tomato plant, and the tomato plant will get the disease. And like I said, you can't fix it. What you need to do to prevent it from infecting other plants is use a mild insecticide like insecticidal soap or neem oil, and that should help with the problem. Another virus is spotted wilt, and spotted wilt also infects the entire plant. Uh, the leaves can look something like this, and the tomatoes themselves will look like this. This is also spread by an insect. The vector is a thrip, and the way you fix the problem is pretty much the same as with the former virus, as you remove the entire plant, you put it in the garbage, you don't compost it, and then you use a mild insecticidal spray on the other tomatoes around it to keep the insects from spreading this disease further. Next, we'll look at a bacteria problem. This is bacterial wilt. The entire plant appears to just wilt. And this could be a problem with insufficient watering. So put some water on it, and if it comes back, no problem. But if you put water on it and it doesn't come back, you've got a pretty serious problem. You need to remove this plant, and you put it in the trash, you don't compost it, and you probably are not going to be able to grow tomatoes in this spot again for a very long time. You're going to have to either change out the soil, or you maybe wait as much as a decade and try it again. This is a problem you don't want to have. Next, let's look at fungus. These are actually the most common problems you're going to see in tomatoes in Knox County. The leaves turn yellow, they get various spots on them like shown in the picture. There's several different kinds of blights, but we can kind of include them all in the same category because they all have the same cause and the same cure. The cause is primarily due to lack of airflow through the plant. That is, there's too many leaves there, and some of the leaves need to be trimmed out so that the air can pass through, and therefore lowering the humidity. Uh, this is made worse by watering the plant from above and leaving the leaves wet, especially like if you go in there in the evening and you spray your tomatoes from the top, they're going to be wet all night, and this is going to promote fungal growth. So what you look for is lower leaves turning yellow with spots. You cut those off, you put them in the trash. The higher up leaves, if it seems to be pretty dense, remove some of the leaves. This is kind of more of an art than a science. You want to be able to see through the tomato plant to the other side, but how many you remove and how many you leave, really depends on how much of a problem you have. If you're having a pretty humid time, you're going to need to remove more leaves. If it's dry, you can pretty much just leave it alone because you're not going to have this particular problem. You can also have fungus problems on your fruit. For instance, buckeye rot is brown spots, and you'll sometimes see this on fruits when you have, again, like the blight, you have humidity problems. You can fix this the same way. You remove the fruits and you put them in the trash, you don't compost them, and you open up the canopy so that you get more air through there, and you make sure you're doing things that will lower the humidity on your plant. Next, there's anthracnose, and you are definitely going to see this. You'll see this on your tomatoes that after you've harvested them, you put them on your counter, and after a few days, you sometimes will see little indentations with a dark spot in the middle, and this is anthracnose. You can go ahead and eat the tomato, just cut out the bad spots. Sometimes you'll see this out in the garden. If you've left a tomato out that's gotten ripe and been out there for a while, and you've got your humidity problems, you will see this anthracnose, and just harvest tomato, cut out the spots, and you're good to go. Next, we have molds, and these Same problem, you got too high humidity, you get mold spores, and they will show up on the tops and bottoms of your leaves. And the problems is fixed the same way as we discussed with the other ones. You lower the humidity, you remove the infected leaves, and you get rid of them. And sometimes if you got a year that's particularly humid for a long period of time and you're noticing more blight and various fungus problems, you can try copper fungicide. I've used this, and you have to use it several times a week, but it can really help if you've got some serious blight problems. You may have seen some mysterious looking codes on tomato packets, and these are disease resistant codes. Usually you will see a capital letter, and they indicate what diseases this particular tomato is known to be resistant to. In our case, we discussed the tomato spotted wilt virus earlier, and you can find TSWV on some tomato packets. So those are the ones you want to get if you have this particular kind of problem. In summary, uh, there's no better way to ensure healthy, disease-free tomatoes than to get a soil test and follow the recommendations. You use pre-planting soil improvement, use proper spacing and pruning, and we'll discuss pruning later. Use crop rotation. Tomatoes shouldn't be grown in the same place, but like once in every 3 years. You also include other tomato relatives such as potatoes and eggplants and peppers. Don't grow them in the same spot, but once every 3 years or so. Use mulching, and you avoid too infrequent overhead watering, and you control the insects. Now, of all these, the most important are get your soil tested, follow the recommendations, and you want to make your soil as healthy as possible. So you want to dig in compost and get good organic loamy kind of soil in your garden for growing your tomatoes on. The healthier the tomato plant is, the more resistance it is to disease, disorders, and insects. Okay, now we're going to discuss disorders. A lot of people see this and they blossom end rot and they kind of freak out. It's like, oh my goodness, what's happening now to my tomatoes? I'll see this at the beginning of the season every year. And what I do is if the tomatoes turn red, I go ahead and pick it off, and I will cut off the dark spot and go ahead and eat it. It's perfectly harmless. This is caused by a calcium deficiency. However, the soil itself may not be calcium deficient. It's just that early in the season, and especially if you put too much nitrogen fertilizer on your plants, you're going to get a lot of leaf growth, and these fast-growing leaves are using all the calcium, and they're depriving the tomatoes of the calcium, so you get blossom end rot. Generally, I get a few of these, I just pick them off and toss them to the side. They're not infectious or anything like that. And when you look on the internet, there's all kinds of old wives' tales about how to fix this problem. Some people will put aspirins in the soil, so you're wasting your money. Generally, if you don't put too much nitrogen fertilizer in your soil, also this can be caused by inconsistent watering. So make sure your plants are getting watered a couple of times a week early in the season. Anyway, it's quick, it's over with, and I don't worry about it that much. Another disorder is growth cracks. You'll see this especially in cherry tomatoes, and these are caused by, you'll have a dry spell and you'll have a heavy rain, and some tomatoes have thin skin, and that cracks because they swell up from the rain. So the way you deal with this problem is you make sure you're watering consistently. It gets watered a couple of times a week. You don't want to go a week without watering and then just flood it, because especially in cherry tomatoes, you're going to see this issue. It doesn't actually seem to harm the plant that much. Just go ahead and pick it and eat it. Cat facing is a disorder you'll also often see early in the season. It's caused by cool evenings that don't allow the plants to properly set the fruit, and you'll see these kinds of, looks like cracks and divots and the like. And actually, although they're kind of ugly, uh, when the tomato matures, you go ahead and eat it. You just trim off the parts that you don't like the looks of. And if you don't like cat facing, just don't plant your tomatoes too early. Wait a while until everything's good and warm, and you won't see much of this problem. Now, leaf roll is caused by a lack of watering, uh, unless, of course, it's the bacterial wilt. So how do you tell? You just water it. If it comes back, fine. In fact, there's been times that I've known that I needed to water my plants because the leaves would roll. And I go like, oh, okay, you need water. Put water on them, they recover. There doesn't seem to be any long-term issues with that. This disorder is herbicide injury, and it's often caused by you or your neighbors using broadleaf herbicides on your lawn. These things will evaporate and then they'll move into your garden and they will damage your tomatoes. They may recover, they probably won't. The key to this is don't use broadleaf herbicides anywhere near tomatoes. You're going to have problems. The tomato fruit worm is a moth caterpillar that bores into the fruit, and it's the same species as the corn earworm. I see this actually rather rarely, and I've maybe seen 3 or 4 of my tomatoes damaged with this. I just pick them off and put them in the trash. However, we'll see in a minute, since this is a caterpillar, it can be treated organically using a insecticide that's based on the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis. It's pretty effective, but like I said, I've only seen it rarely, so I don't really worry about it too much. Now, this is a chewing pest. It's a tomato hornworm, and they will eat the leaves and the fruits. And one of the more interesting things about this is about the largest caterpillar you're going to see. It's from a hawk moth, and they're about the size of a finger. And I've never seen one in my garden, and I'd kind of like to because they are large and pretty and unusual. But if I were to see it, I would wait a little while because nature tends to take its course with these guys. There are parasitic wasps that lay eggs on them, and they will kill the caterpillar and make more parasitic wasps. It'll go down around, hunt down other caterpillars. So, you know, it might be best just to let nature take its course with this guy. But again, this is also susceptible to the Bacillus thuringiensis insecticide that we'll look at here in a second. There it is. One brand of the Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria is this thurgicide. It's bonide, and I've used it. You just follow the instructions, mix up the spray. I end up spraying this more on things like kale because they seem to be particularly susceptible to caterpillar damage. But anytime you see caterpillars damaging your crops, this is probably the most benign way of dealing with that particular issue. An example of a sap-sucking pest are stink bugs. They'll get on the surface of ripe fruits and they suck the sap out, leaving yellowish dots like in the picture. The fruit itself isn't terribly damaged. I mean, you can go ahead and wash them off and eat them, it's no problem. It's mainly aesthetic. I would recommend just taking a cup of soapy water out into your garden and just knocking these guys off into the water to help get rid of them. You can spray them, using some mild insecticide. Another sap-sucking insect are whiteflies. We mentioned this earlier as a vector for the yellow leaf curl virus. They're very small, and you need a magnifying glass to actually see them like this. I've noticed them before where I kind of wondered what was going on with a tomato plant, and I smacked it with the back of my hand and got a little cloud of white, coming off of it. And on closer inspection, turned out that they were these whiteflies. As you can see, they're quite small on the leaves, and the problem mainly is that they are a vector for viruses. And the best way to deal with these pests is to just wash them off with a hard stream of water. That tends to be very effective. If they come back, then try mild insecticides such as neem oil or an insecticidal soap. Another sapsucker pest are thrips. These cause damage to leaves that looks a bit like the damage that whiteflies cause. And like the whiteflies, they are vectors for a virus, the spotted wilt, as we saw earlier. And you deal with these sort of the same way. Of course, you have to discard the whole plant once you've got the wilt, spotted wilt. But if you just see the thrips and they haven't spread the virus yet, you can try just hosing them off. And if they come back, then use a mild insecticide, again, like I said, neem oil or insecticidal soap. Another sapsucker is potato aphids. In this case, you can see the little black and yellow striped bug on there. This is a larvae for the ladybug, and they will just, this is kind of like watching a Wild Kingdom program when you see one of these. That ladybug larvae just walks along and just sucks these things up like a kid eating jelly beans. Again, you can get rid of the aphids by hosing them off first, and if they come back, then try a mild insecticide. Sometimes you'll see a plant that seems to be sickly or dying back and you're not sure what's going on. You pull it out and you notice the roots look like these roots in the picture, and you've likely got root knot nematode. What you want to do about this, of course, is dispose of the plant, but you want to avoid growing tomatoes on this particular piece of soil for several years, normal crop rotation. But in between, you want to grow some plants like coles, like broccoli or cauliflower. You also might want to try growing marigolds, and they tend to help lower the nematode count in the soil, so that when you get back to growing tomatoes there again, you'll have fewer to deal with. The other thing is there are some tomatoes that are specifically resistant to nematodes, and you can see that as a code on the package, and we discussed codes earlier. So try those. Subterranean pest. This comes to the surface to feed it. Like in the picture here, you've got a cutworm that has cut a small corn plant stalk, and what they do is they live under the ground, and they'll come up at night and they will girdle a stem. They just go around it, chew on it, and go back under the ground. The plant dies. If you see plants cut off like this, that cutworm will be somewhere under the soil within about 6 inches of the plant. So dig around until you find it and kill it. So let's summarize some of the best control methods for growing tomatoes in the home garden. First of all, you want to make sure you have the healthiest soil possible. Get your soil tested, follow the recommendations, work compost into the soil, and when you have healthy soil, you're going to have healthy tomato plants, and these healthy tomato plants are more resistant to insect damage. You want to mulch, as we've discussed, and you want to water properly, as we've discussed. Again, it keeps the plant healthy. Another very important thing is scouting. That is, you go out every day or so and you just look at your garden, look at your plants, so that you can see if you're developing problems, you can catch it early enough to do something about it before it gets out of control. You want to rotate your crops about once every 3 years for tomatoes, maybe longer if you've got more land to use. You can use companion planting. For instance, I like to plant basil with my tomatoes, and it's reported that the basil helps repel insects, but also basil goes really well with tomatoes in most cooking applications. When you find insects, you can try hand picking them like we saw with the stink bugs. Just knock them off into a cup of soapy water. You can encourage beneficial insects. For instance, when you see a caterpillar that's got the parasitic wasps on it, just leave it there and let the parasitic wasps hatch, and they will do a lot of the patrolling for you and killing of the caterpillars for you. You can use insecticides, use the mildest insecticide that you can get by with, primarily because these commercial insecticides tend to have toxicity about them that you just really, I personally anyway, am never quite sure what I'm dealing with, so I tend to try to use things like insecticidal soap or neem oil wherever possible. But if you do want to use a commercial insecticide, make sure you read the directions very carefully and apply them exactly as recommended. Next, let's look at cultural practice recommendations. These are the recommended techniques for growing the healthiest tomatoes that you can have. First, when do you put the tomato out into the soil? You don't want to put them out too early because tomatoes are particularly susceptible to frost damage. Also, if they're trying to grow when the evenings are cool, you're going to get more cases of blossom end rot and cat facing, and the plant's just not really going to grow very fast. I typically wait to grow my tomatoes, put them in the ground on May the 1st, but I also start mine indoors so I have some good sized plants by the time I put them out. If you're going to plant them from seeds in the soil, then probably the best recommendation is around April the 15th in Knox County. As you see, the Knoxville frost-free dates, they average between April the 13th and October the 23rd. They can, in the best case, be March 29th and November the 5th, and the worst case, April the 28th to October the 8th. Now, seems like we've been having some very weird climate conditions going on lately, so it's kind of hard to predict, and I would just go ahead with the recommendation of starting the plants indoors, putting them out May the 1st, or starting them outdoors around April the 15th. You want to use support structures. You want to keep the tomatoes off the ground. So for instance, if you're growing determinate tomatoes, the bush types, you can go ahead and get these store-bought tomato cages, the ones you get in the big box store. These are perfectly fine for the determinants, which only grow 4 or 5 feet in any case. And you can actually use them for indeterminates if you're careful to train the tomato around the cage, so it's kind of like a spiral or a little tomato tornado. I find some of my indeterminate tomatoes get to be 12 feet long, and so that takes a lot of wrapping around a 5-foot tall cage to accommodate them. For the actually for the indeterminate types, we recommend trellises, or you build some kind of cage. I'll show a picture of some here in a minute. You can also use long stakes, 6-foot long stakes. You tie them about every 8 to 10 inches with some kind of very soft fabric. Okay, let's look here. This is an example of tying them to a stake. You see how the fabric is just very loosely tied on there. You don't want to strangle the vine by tying it on too tight. And if it's a soft fabric, then when the wind blows and birds land on them and things like that, it'd be less likely to damage the stem. Now, trellises, these are 2 trellises, trellis types. If you look this up on the internet, you're going to see just a million different kinds of ways of doing this. The trellis on the left is the one I use, and I use pea netting, and I weave my tomato plants into the pea netting. I try to weave them in at a 45 to 60 degree angle because, as like I said, my indeterminates will get 12 feet tall, and these cages are 7 feet tall, so I'm going to have to do some accommodating that height. The trellis on the right uses rebar and cattle panels, and it's a very sturdy kind of panel, and it works well for, in this particular case, this individual tends to top the tomatoes and remove a lot of leaves to promote fruit growth. So either way, another popular way of trellising tomatoes is using what's called a Florida weave, and you put stakes every other tomato plant, and you weave twine as sort of like shown in the picture here. And as the plant gets taller, you add more twine weavings to hold it in position. This is an example of some of the big box store tomato cages that are growing Juliet tomatoes. In this case, most of the lower leaves have been removed to reduce the amount of disease splashing up from the soil. You also see that we're using soaker hoses, and that the vines, after they're up about a foot or two, they are trained pretty radically to the horizontal and allowed to wrap around the cages. Also, you'll note that we're growing marigolds. They help repel insects. Now, weed control. If you leave the soil bare, you're going to get weeds, and so you can hoe them, but you need to remember the tomato roots are very shallow, so you want to do very shallow, light hoeing. But the best way to deal with weeds is actually to use mulch or straw, because not only do they shade out the weeds, but as they break down, they provide nutrients to the soil. You'll see a lot of people using landscape fabric, where they'll cut an X into the landscape fabric and they'll put the tomato plant in there. That's fine for commercial users and even for your home garden, with one what I consider a major exception. They prevent uh, nutrients from getting into the soil. Not only do they block the rain, so you have to have drip irrigation of some type underneath the fabric, but you want to be adding a lot of mulch or compost to your soil to improve the soil health, and these fabrics block them. I used one, I tried this for a couple of years in one place and basically killed the soil underneath the fabric, because I didn't put organic material down that then the earthworms could circulate and improve my soil. So I basically had a bed of solid dead clay, and it took a while to recover. So you'll see the commercial users, uh, commercial farmers anyway, using this, but they'll rip it up every year and they will plow in all kinds of materials before putting it back down again. That just seems like too much trouble to me for a home garden. Watering. This is critical in controlling the fungal diseases, as we discussed earlier. Tomatoes need about an inch of water a week, and if it's really hot, like it often gets in Knox County, it's going to need 2 inches a week. And it's best to split this up twice a week. Don't put 1 or 2 inches down on Sunday if it hasn't rained for the week prior to that, because that in itself is going to cause problems like the splitting. Okay, so you don't use a sprinkler to water tomatoes. You want to keep those leaves as dry as possible, and the way you do that is you water at the base. You water early in the morning is best. That way, if you get the water on the leaves, it has the day to dry out. And if you can't get to them early in the morning, water them in the early evening, and just like I said, be sure and water at the base. The best way to water tomatoes is using drip irrigation or soaker hoses. And of course, they don't splash water up onto the leaves. Pruning. This is actually another very important thing for growing the healthiest tomatoes possible. Again, you want the leaves to be as dry as you can keep them. So you want air to be able to flow through your tomatoes. If you have a really dense leafy tomato growth, then it's going to prevent the air from circulating, and it makes a high humid environment that's perfect for funguses. So you want to just kind of observe the plant, and if it looks like there's a lot of foliage, go ahead and just cut some of the leaves out until you can see through the plant, and you know that the air is going to be circulating properly through the tomato plant. The other recommendation we'll have is for, like, if you're growing especially indeterminate plants, is you want to decide how many leaves you have on your plant. At every leaf, you're going to get a sucker, and each sucker can form a new leaf. So you want to prune those suckers off, and you need to decide ahead of time how many leaves you want. If you're planting your plants close together, you might only want 1 lead. If you're planting them 2 feet apart, you might go ahead and grow 4 leads. This is something that's kind of your own personal preferences. After a while, you'll figure out what seems to work best for you. But really, with indeterminate plants, you're not going to want more than about 4 leads. The determinate plants, you don't prune out the suckers. They grow up and they stop growing and produce all their tomatoes like over a couple of weeks period of time, and then you're done with them. Okay, so the initial pruning, and this is again for indeterminate tomatoes. When I grow mine indoors, sometimes they will be as much as a foot tall before I put them out in the ground. And what I do is I cut off the bottom leaves up to the first flowering branch. And as you can see, that's the lowest flower cluster. There'll be 3 or 4 leaves below that, and you just cut those off, and that allows the upper leaves to be further away from the soil and for the risk of splashing diseases up onto them, and it also helps add to airflow. Now, pruning for suckers, you see these suckers grow between the main stem and the leaf coming out. There's a little notch in there, and you'll get what looks like a little tomato plant coming out of it. I've seen this recommendation of you just go ahead and you cut the whole thing off, or you do what's called Missouri pruning, which is you cut it off after the first set of leaves on that sucker, and that prevents the sucker from turning into a lead, but it also leaves a couple of leaves there to provide nutrition to the plant. Crop rotation. We've mentioned this before, but this is again critical to the health of the tomato plants. You want to only grow tomatoes and relatives of tomatoes, that is the Solanaceae plants such as eggplants, peppers, and potatoes. You want to grow them only like once every 3 or 4 years in the same spot. If you've got a lot of garden space, you can stretch it out longer, and the longer you go between growing tomatoes in one spot, the healthier those tomatoes are likely to be. The harvest. Okay, once you've harvested your tomatoes, they turn bright red, and you bring them into the house. You never refrigerate a tomato. This is, controversial. You'll see people arguing on the internet about it, but there's actually been research done that shows that the flavor components of the tomato are reduced by refrigeration and improved by just leaving the tomato out on the counter. If you harvest your tomatoes a little bit before they're completely ripe, which some people do, it's okay. You bring it in and you let it complete ripening on the countertop. Well, some people will try to accelerate the ripening by putting it in the windowsill, but you don't want to do that. It'll just heat up the tomato and cause it to rot. Now, more controversy, some people say that it's okay to bring in green tomatoes and ripen them on the countertop. I personally think that they're much better flavor if you just let them ripen on the vine, vine ripened tomatoes. When you store them on the countertop, it's stem side down, bottom side up, and you don't wash them until you use them. Now, we saw the anthracnose problem, that's the fruit rot, those little divots, and sometimes they will come on pretty quickly after you harvest the tomato. Some people will soak their tomatoes in a little bit of vinegar before leaving them on the countertop, and they claim that this helps to reduce the anthracnose. So if you're having anthracnose problems, you might want to go ahead and try that. Now, your final harvest is, remember, the indeterminate tomatoes will grow until the first frost. And when the first frost comes, that plant will die immediately. So keep track of the weather. And some people, like maybe about a month before the first frost, they'll cut off the end of the leads, that is the growing terminal buds off of their tomatoes, and this kind of causes the tomato plant to start putting all of its energy into the fruits, and so you'll get more healthier tomatoes by doing that. But if you go ahead and just let the whole plant grow up until the frost, make sure you know the frost is coming the next day, and then go out there and just harvest all your tomatoes. You'd be a bunch of green tomatoes, and what I do is I just bring those in and dice them up and make a green salsa. So I kind of look forward to that every year. If you've got some green tomatoes and they're look like they might be near to ripening, you can put them in a paper bag with a banana or an apple, and that will help accelerate the ripening process. Okay, let's summarize the whole talk with some guidelines. Just remember, and I keep emphasizing this, you want the healthiest soil you can have. So you get your soil tested and you follow the recommendations. You work some compost into the soil and you loosen the soil, and you just want the best prepared fertile bed that you can have. Do not water with a sprinkle. Do water at the base and be careful not to splash the leaves. Don't water in the heat of the day. So water in the early morning or the evening, and you mulch with leaves or straw, and you don't start your plants with high nitrogen fertilizer. You know, if you go out there and put them in the ground, you put Miracle-Gro on them, you're going to get a lot of leaves, and those leaves are going to be at the expense of your fruits. You don't let the tomato stems lay on the ground. You want to use some kind of trellising or staking for your plants. And you do rotate your crops. Okay? Now, you want to frequently scout for problems. As you walk around your garden, you know, every day if you can, a couple of times a week if you don't really have the time, and you look for problems. You can often catch problems early. Maybe you go out and you see a few stink bugs on your tomatoes, get rid of them then. If you wait a week, you come out there, they'll be completely covered, and you know, they'll be a lot harder to take care of. If you're having particular problems, you want to use disease-resistant cultivars. You can tell this by looking at those codes on your tomato packets. Uh, okay, I personally much prefer hand picking to get rid of insects, you know, caterpillars and the like off of my tomatoes, because I don't really like to use insecticides. But if you do use insecticides, use the least harmful that you can. If you have caterpillar problems, use the BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis. That examples that thurgicide product. But if you have to use insecticides, try the mildest you can first, like neem oil or insecticidal soap. And finally, if you're going to use the store-bought insecticides, read the instructions carefully and follow those directions precisely, because these commercial pesticides can be quite harmful to people and pets. Some more. Your harvest, you do not refrigerate your tomatoes. You don't ripen them in the window. You store them bottom up on your countertop. Now, next, I'm going to recommend a couple of books. First, The Heirloom Tomato by Amy Goldman. I love this book. It's got beautiful pictures in it. This is an example of a tomato that the author found in Italy, and she named after her father's delicatessen, so it's called the Goldman Italian American. And it's a beautiful tomato. And this book has not only gorgeous pictures, it's kind of like tomato porn, but they have pages of dense information about various aspects of the flavor of the tomato and cultural practices for the tomato. So it's just a beautiful book that's packed with information. I highly recommend it. The next book is Epic Tomatoes by Craig LaHoulier. And this is a great book. If you want to learn an awful lot about tomatoes, you want to get this book. Craig LaHoulier is the guy that introduced Cherokee purple tomatoes to the world, so we got to love him for that. This is inside, and again, it kind of gives you a very nice walkthrough on what you need to be doing to grow great, healthy tomatoes. So now, more specific information for Knox County, you want to get UT Extension publications. My favorite set of publications from them is the Tennessee Vegetable Garden Series, and they're numbered W346A through H, and the H publication is Growing Tomatoes, which is some more Tennessee specific information. It's just a really good publication. There are several other publications you have there, and You can go ahead and search their website at extension.tennessee.edu.publications. And finally, proof that bunnies come from tomato gardens. Well, I hope you've learned a lot from this talk. And if you have additional questions, just remember you can call 215-2340. That's the Knox County Extension Service phone number. You leave a message, and then either an extension agent or a master gardener will research your question and we'll get back to you shortly. We have a handout as a PDF file that you can download by clicking the bunny tomato picture. It has the summary guidelines and a lot of the other information presented in the talk. Well, I hope this was time well spent for you. It was for me. Thank you for watching.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you learned something that will help you in your gardening endeavors, whether that means more blooms on your flowers and ornamental shrubs, attracting more pollinators to your garden, or improving your vegetable production. As we were not able to field your questions today, we want to close by offering you some ways to reach us. As you can see on this slide, we have a presence on Facebook. You may post questions to either of these Facebook pages. Feel free to upload a photo, especially if it helps to describe the problem you have. If you are not a Facebook user, you may call the Extension office at 865-215-2340 and leave a detailed message with your question. Your question will be forwarded to a Master Gardener to research and respond to you. You may also send an email to Ryland Thompson, the Knox County Extension agent who advises the local Master Gardener program. If a photo would help to describe the problem, feel free to attach one or two. Try to keep the total attachments to less than 5 megabytes. You may get a response directly from Ryland, or he may route your question to a Master Gardener to research and respond to you. We are eager to return to public presentations. In the meantime, you can watch any of our recorded presentations by going to our website, finding a Speakers Bureau event on the calendar, and clicking on the link that is included within the event details. Now, let's go get some dirt under our fingernails.